Hi, Dr. Flight here. We are going to have a little introduction to different types of prototypes. So when we do prototype testing or product use testing, we oftentimes have our consumer or have somebody, our test subjects, using some type of product. And it might be a comprehensive type of a product version that has everything working on it, or it could be a part of a product, like a focused prototype, where we're only focusing on one particular attribute or feature of the actual product. But we have different prototype versions. Different ways we can design prototypes. And so this discussion, this segment, is just an introduction to different forms of prototypes that we can create after the design phase, but generally just before we start ramping up production. We want one more test of the product use test, and we often use a prototype to help us do that. As we move forward, I wanted to just take a second to think about where we are in the product development process. As you recall, we begin with firm strategy. We've moved forward through opportunity, firm strategy, opportunity identification. We talked a bit about concept generation. We also talked a bit about concept evaluation. And now we're right here in design, product use testing, and also prototypes. So here's the point in time where we have a product architecture. The product has been designed, and what we want to do is begin something called use testing, where we want customers, ideally customers, to try the product in their hands, let them use it. If it's a service, we want them to start using the beta type of service. We want them to try out our product and provide us feedback so that we can ensure that the product is doing what we want it to do. In fact, we are going to ultimately ask 4 questions as we develop our prototypes and we start to do this use testing. We want to think about what the scope of the prototype is, or what the purpose of the prototype is, then what the scope of the prototype is, followed by the type of prototype that we'll use and the longevity and the actual test that we want to engage in when we get to the actual prototype. So to think about this, or to move forward a little bit, what is the purpose of the prototype? What is it we want to achieve? There are 3 things here that we want to be able to ask and figure out. We want to ask, does the product function or operate as intended? Okay, so a prototype is not it's not going to typically be a production run. It may be if it's a small batch, or if it's something that can be produced in a batch type of a thing. But the prototype will often be something that did not necessarily come off of the assembly line or the manufacturing process. And we want to know at this point, and it may be a crude version of our product, but we want to know if it works right. And if it operates as we think it, if it moves the way we think it should move. We want to ask if the quality is acceptable, if it's within our tolerances for the quality standards that we have met in production, in our production capacity, but also from a customer's perspective, we want to know if the tolerances and quality meets their standards. And ultimately, that's what we want to ask is, does it meet the end user's needs? So this is a big issue. We want to make sure it actually solves the customer's problem. They have a problem and we want to solve it with our product. And like, does it solve their problem? And very importantly, does it solve their problem better than the competitor, or what they're currently using to solve the problem that they have? Or need that they have. It might be a need as well. Like it might be some type of a want rather than anything else. Okay, so basically that's what we want to think about and kind of why we're developing the prototype and why we're going to do product use testing. We want to know, one, does the product work? Does it meet our quality standards? And does it satisfy the customer's needs? So that brings us to the second question. What is the scope of the prototype? Now, when we talk about scope, we actually are talking about the extent to which the product is in finished form. So we're going to have two different things to consider. One is a comprehensive prototype. The comprehensive prototype is a complete, fully functioning, full-size product ready for the end user to look at and feel, and it's very close to what they would experience in a purchase environment. You may not have packaging, the final colors might not be there, the final finish may not be exactly right, the name might not be on the product quite yet, but the function of the product works. Okay, so that's a comprehensive prototype. A focused prototype is one that in part works, but it's not necessarily designed to work completely. So it's not a fully functioning or a fully developed final product necessarily, but it has certain design features that do work. So we want to focus our effort on some feature of the product that it is probably a technological part of the product that we have fixed or finished, and we want to test to make sure that that actually meets the needs of the customer. So it's kind of like if you have a flashlight, what's important is the light that's coming out of it, and what's less important is the handle that's being held. So maybe if it uses a real new technology to create light, maybe that's what we're testing in a focus sense, and we'll figure out the handle part later on. We want to make sure that we got this piece fixed or finished first, so that we can move forward. So a crude example here, or an example, is just a working prototype of an electric bicycle. So the final operating bike might not be completely set, but part of it might be. So a foam or wooden bike is used to determine the reaction. So sometimes we do this with like the car manufacturers will create a clay mock-up of a car, and they want to get people's visual aesthetics, people's opinion of the visual aesthetics of the car. So sometimes they'll do a mock-up like that. So anyways, focused prototypes are prototypes that work in part but not completely, and we want to assess the working part. Comprehensive prototype is going to be one that is completely finished. So that's this idea of what the scope is. That last question asked how long of the test, or what specific type of test could we be running? And so there are actually a number of different types of prototypes that are available to us. So there's a concept model. So this is just a illustration of a model. So we make a model, like a physical model of what the product would look like from materials that we have available to us. And again, it may only focus on a piece of the pie that we're looking at. We might use it as an illustration or a demonstration in a concept test. Okay, so just a concept model. Again, the car manufacturer that might create a clay version or illustration of a new body style, that would be a concept model. Developmental prototype would be a version to maybe figure out the best size of the product. It's a focused prototype that may focus on how the product works in a specific condition or circumstance that the product might be used in. So a developmental prototype would be a crude version of the prototype that's used in a specific situation, and assuming it passes that specific situation, we might test it in a couple other arenas as well. The alpha prototype, the alpha test, is a version of the prototype where the product is working for the most part. However, what we're trying to do is test the workability of the product typically inside the organization. So I'll have my own R&D staff and my own employees try the product in a fairly rough form. So it may have the final materials, but it's not in production, and it's really an earlier prototype version. We're not ready for the customers to see it yet. That would be a beta type, a beta test. In a beta test, it's one where we have most of the kinks worked out. It's a fully functioning, typically, so we may have a comprehensive type of a prototype at this point where we want our end user, usually we want our end user to try the product at this point, give us feedback, and so we can make, hopefully at this point, make minor modifications to the actual product. The last type of prototype would be a pre-production prototype. This prototype is like very close to the finished product, but it may be something that was created in a small batch. So we ran the production line for a little while. We have a small batch produced. So we have a batch type of a thing. We might want to have a focus group with our lead users play around with this. We might want to send some of our lead users or innovators who would buy this product first. We might want to send them a version of this and let them use it. And test it out in that sense as well. So we have a concept model, developmental prototypes to focus on very, very specific features or parts. So a focus type of a test usually is going on with the developmental prototype. We have alpha tests, alpha prototypes, beta prototypes, and then we have small batch production prototypes that are near finish, and we maybe want to do a slow rollout or something. So we're doing some use tests, some simulated use tests probably with our lead users involved with that. Now, one more test which is not always mentioned or always discussed is something called a gamma test. So in a gamma test, what we're wanting to do is test the long-term effects of a product, the long-term effects and usefulness in the life of a particular product. This is usually an external test, but ultimately what we want to do is we want to know how long the product will last and what the effects will be from the product upon long-term use. So if you can imagine pharmaceutical companies needing to test this type of thing, maybe you have a manufacturing like an automobile and you want it, or a car tire, and you want to know how long the car tire will last. There's a case where you're testing the tire to failure and you want to know how long. It's a thorough test to reach a point in which the product won't last any longer. So it's a thorough use and evaluation of the new product. It's probably the most thorough or desirable test, but it's not particularly realistic because they take a lot of time and they expose the company to a lot of media exposure or exposure to the competitors. Competitors will pick up and see what you're building, and it's hard to protect the integrity of your product if it's way out in the open there. So there are a lot of cost considerations that are issued here, and then also again being able to keep an eye on your competitors or allowing them to not see what you're doing is kind of the realistic, kind of downfall of doing a gamma test. However, sometimes we do truly want to know when a product fails, especially if you consider if you're willing to create a warranty for your product, you want to know how long that warranty should last. And if you want to know that, then you need to know how long the product lasts before it fails. So if you're thinking about, the cost of providing a warranty in claims, it's directly tied into how long the product will actually do its job before failing, and therefore you need to know when it will fail and why it will fail. So a lot of testing may be done here to find failure points. Okay, so the last element here that we've mentioned before, but we'll mention again, is prototyping or rapid prototyping using 3D or computer-aided technologies, 3D prototypes and so forth, printing. Computer-aided design, of course, is nothing new. It's not something that hasn't been around for a while. But the idea of being able to design prototypes fairly rapidly and have them printed fairly rapidly is new. So that's a big deal. And so being able to create a rapid prototype out of different composite materials that, again, may not be the final material you're going to use, but it allows you to produce something very quickly, from minutes to days, and can be done very early in the process without a huge amount of cost. It certainly is not an issue where we're dealing with a production line that has to be in place before we have units produced. It's something that we can do way before that, in the design phase even, and potentially even in a concept evaluation phase if we want to. So rapid prototyping, again, allows us to be able to do these types of things. The prototypes, early and often with fairly limited costs. So as we're moving forward, we talked about the key questions that prototypes and product use testing should help us answer. Within the marketplace, the quality tolerances and whether the product does what we want it to do. Actually, we talked about this idea that there are comprehensive and focused prototypes. We talked about different prototype testing or tests that are used, from concept all the way down to the small batch types of forms, and gamma tests as well. And we talked about rapid prototyping. That has enhanced the prototyping process immensely over just the last few years.